Okay. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thanks for attending. There's quite a big turnout. Yeah, so I guess I'll start by introducing ourselves. At least I will if this works. Yay. All right. Cool. So I'm Rahman, and this is Sam.
Hey.
And yeah, we're the directors and developers at BitDragon, which is a new studio. Yeah, we're working out of the arcade, and we have been,
Since about April or so?
Yeah, since about April. Yeah, working full time on our first game, Hyperjam, and yeah, we basically just wanted to share our experience taking this game from the student project to where we are today. So yeah, just before I get into anything, this is our first GCAP, both attending and our first talk. So, and we haven't shipped our title, so you know your mileage may vary. We're mainly just talking about basically just like common pitfalls and mistakes we see in other student games, and especially ones that we've fallen into ourselves, as well as sharing what's worked for us. And yeah, lastly, we're making a top-down game, like PvP game in Unreal. So yeah, we've tried to keep it pretty general, but yeah, there will obviously be some tips that won't be applicable to all games, but hopefully everyone can get something from this. So yeah, like I said, we're here to share the lessons we've learned while making Hyperjam. And yeah, I think just to give you all a bit of context on the history of the game and how we got to where we are today. Yeah, we started making Hyperjam in 2015, as it was our final year project at Swinburne. And we, for some reason, after graduating, we thought, okay, this is pretty fun. Maybe we'll just polish it up for a few months and then release. I'll show you what the game looked like at that point, and you'll see why we were so terribly wrong. So yeah, this is Hyperjam back in 2015. See, it's basically
it's a student project.
It very much looks like a student project. You know, there's very visually noisy and low fidelity graphics. There's problems all over the place. So instead of polishing it up for a few months, what we did was work in the industry over the next year and work on this on weekends. We'd meet up once a week and yeah, basically just do as much polish as we could. And yeah, now, this year we got basically by polishing it throughout the year, we managed to score some funding with FilmVic, and this is what the game looks like today. So yeah, as you can see, it's come a long way. And yeah, we'd just like to share a lot of the errors that we made, and hopefully you can avoid making the same mistakes. And yeah. Yeah, so I'll pass off to Sam now.
Yeah, so one of the most important things we've changed recently is the readability of the game. So if you saw from the previous slides or videos of the older versions, they were quite cluttered and noisy. So we've actually changed that recently, like a bit too recently for comfort. Because yeah, it's like you need to use contrast very sparingly to highlight what's important to the player, what they need to know about, what they need to see. If you have contrasting background elements that aren't that important, they're going to drown out the actual important things that the players need to know and see.
Yeah, we see this all the time when we're playing other student games, and just in general, we see it a lot, just like amateur developers on the forums. It's clearly their first project, and this is the number one issue we see. Every game has so much saturation, so much contrast, so much unnecessary detail and noise that detracts from what the player needs to be focusing on.
So this is actually a screenshot from last year's version of the game. As you can see, there's just blood all over the place. We developed the game with this idea that we wanted the game to be based around this kind of progression, the arena gets dirtier and dirtier as you play on it, and by the end of the match, it's just this this mess of destruction and blood and bodies everywhere and stuff like that. And we're like this whole time, which yeah, that's really cool. Let's keep doing that. But I mean, at the end of a match, it looks a bit gross. Like there's all this blood like splattered everywhere. And so what we did is we actually had the blood fade out over time. Well, actually, it doesn't come out on damage hits anymore, just when you die, and also bleeds out of ragdolls instead of just like every single time someone takes damage.
Yeah, we've spent the last few months. Seriously, a large portion of what we've been doing recently is just removing effects and decals and cleanup of all this stuff that we added as students, thinking oh cool, and it's not something that happens overnight, oh let's suddenly add all this stuff. It's a slow process. You add new particles and new decals and new things, destructibles, and over time this stuff starts to really add up. Yeah. And we found that recently, so if you compare to recent screenshots, it's just
there's a few bodies there with a bit of localized blood, but it's not, covering the entire map. A few scorch marks there, but they're much, lower contrast.
Yeah, it was just something that wasn't very intuitive to us until fairly recently. That, it's just really the overall theme. Less is more, I guess, and being very consciously aware of that, and just how much more value we've gotten from stripping elements back from the game, rather than adding more into it.
Yeah, subtractive design.
Yeah, so with another part of the game that we found was lacking after we did a lot of this cleanup was the animation. We had a lot of our animations were instantaneous, so you couldn't react to them. There was popping between animations. There was everything just looked it was like chess pieces moving around. Everyone's so upright and static. Some of the just a few high value tasks you can do to improve your animations. Yeah, make sure there's always enough lead-in frames so you can react to things. So this is quite a sensitive value because it needs to be quick enough to feel responsive. But for example,
or other players really you need to react to. Yeah,
for example, in our game, when you would throw a weapon, it used to be just instantaneous because we're our thinking at the time was it has to feel instant response and feel so snappy. But then we had other issues where players couldn't react to weapons being thrown at them. So there's a sweet spot there where it's more readable as to what happened, and you can still have it feeling just as snappy. Also just with anything in game dev, we just lerp everything. The same applies to animations. Just you can go pretty crazy on your blend trees and animation setups. Unreal has awesome tools for all of this, it's quite cool. For example, we use sub animation instances and stuff to make sure all our animation logic is quite modular. For example, we have the base layer of just our locomotion, running, and all of that, and then we have an individual animation asset per weapon. So it defines weapons can basically take that base motion and then override the elements as they need. For example, our katana overrides the arm only, but preserves the rest of the body, whereas the hammer can do a full body override to use both hands. It's also good to represent charging, to asymptote towards a final pose instead of actually reaching it, because we found that was quite static. For example, in our game, you can raise a hammer, and then when you let go, it smashes down. It felt quite static to be and reach this final pose, but now it feels like your character's just getting stronger and stronger as you just asymptote towards that pose. Spending a bit long on this slide, so I'll just jump into the next clip. It's just an example of us adding leaning into your velocity and the rotation. So it's just, this is the before clip of one of our characters running around, which looks okay.
It's pretty upright.
But as you can see, it's it looks like his back is just always totally straight. And here's what it looks like just by simply adding one layer of blending to lean into the into his velocity and into his curve. So you can see as he's running in a circle, he's like sort of centered towards that that pivot point. So that's just like another high value thing you can do.
Yeah, I'll talk about this one. So for UI, like UI is really useful for conveying all sorts of information. Depending on what your game is, you might prefer to show UI over the screen at certain points to kind of call out information, things that are important to the player. We tend to prefer in-game effects like particles and things like that to convey this information. It just seems like more elegant. You don't have UI cluttering the whole screen everywhere. So that's a decision you have to make. It'll depend game to game.
I think generally speaking, though, I think we've found it feels like almost like a cop out to directly go to like text for like A to pick up this weapon, or just like directly showing the prompt and the button
or state changes.
Yes, state changes like
it works. It's really obvious what's happening, but if you can avoid it, it's cleaner not to.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to the less is more thing, because once you start doing that for everything, you have so many text prompts coming up all over the place, and you don't know where to look and which one to read, and it becomes messy. So, yeah, I think it's acceptable, but just use it very sparingly, and generally we've found at least it's better as a last resort, since there's more unique ways and more natural feeling ways to convey things.
Yeah, it's easier for players to look at their avatar than the edge of the screen. It's pretty good to put health and things or anything that the player needs to really frequently look at and see it's updating. You put that on the character, they'll be looking at their character all the time. If you put that on the edge of the screen, they have to look down. It's especially applicable to local multiplayer games.
I was going to say, this is definitely one that specifically applies to our kind of game, where it is shared screen, very fast paced. You don't have time to in Smash Bros. It's like there's a fair amount of downtime between interactions at times, for example, and you have time to look down and decode who it belongs to or whatever. But in our game, quite frequently the action is so frenetic, and you always have to have your eye on the ball. You're going to just eat a grenade and lose.
Another example would be Overwatch, like the number of heroes that have HUD that goes over the center where your crosshair is, as opposed to just the bottom left or the bottom right. Really makes things easier to see. It just makes a huge difference if you can not force your your player's eyes to the edge of the screen every second to see things updating. It makes a pretty big difference. Another thing is, if you want good-looking UI, first design it outside the engine. Just take it into Photoshop, start from scratch, design what you ideally want your UI to look like. You won't be held back by the constraints of the engine. You'll end up with something that just looks much nicer than if you designed it in-engine with all the constraints, all the technical constraints there. The downside to that is it can be difficult to make your Photoshop concept actually work in-engine.
That's the thing. It's often challenging, but time and time again, we see this people they design the UI and engine specifically working under the constraints. But there's always a way around it.
Yeah.
It's just like a one-way ticket to programmer art, basically.
We did our first UI in engine, right, rather than in Photoshop first.
Yeah. We learned that the hard way, that's for sure.
This is our most recent version. We did in Photoshop.
Before,
yeah. Anyway, this looks pretty much the same as it did in the Photoshop mock-up, but it's just way better than we have to fake so many things to actually get it working in engine, all the text glow and stuff. It was a bit messy and a bit hard, but it just looks so much better than if we had done it in engine.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really big thing.
Yeah. Do you want to do this one as well?
Yeah, sure. Audio. Generally, snappy sounds just sound better in games. If you have something that occurs once, just make it quick. Don't drag it on for 3 or 4 seconds.
It's something. Yeah. Before we had the experience to call out these kind of things would often hear a sound and just, your gut reaction is like, oh, that's cool. And, you just chuck it in. But, yeah, and I don't know why, I'm not really sure why this happens, but yeah, we see it a lot with like other newer developers. There's often very long, messy sounds that, yeah, it just really it slows the game down and it feels, yeah, almost, yeah, just like very sluggish and noisy,
it's like if you have something that, changes something that occurs instantly and then a sound that, keeps playing for the next 2 or 3 seconds, it's like, what's
having
this
the game,
caused
basically the audio mimic the mechanics makes for better conveyance and, yeah, it's basically just better in every way.
Yeah, really good.
The other thing, the other thing is that we can actually react quicker to audio cues and visual cues. So, again, this is something that particularly applies to our fast-paced game, but we found that yeah, it was much easier for people to react to something happening if there's an audio cue to precede the event that they need to react to. They get a feel for the rhythm and the timing that they need to execute. For example, someone lunging in with a punch, it used to be, okay, we'll have an impact sound. But yeah, well, it's not in the game yet. The current prototype though, the characters always like yell sort of before they punch. So like, huh, dish, huh, and then the character can react to the player can react to the character's voice instead of having to like keep an eye out for the visuals. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing you can do is minimize the repetition in your audio by not just using a few different sounds that you've made for the same cue in game, but you can use modulation and runtime blending. Basically, you could say like every time this sound plays, randomly offset the pitch or the volume by 10-20%. That's built into the Unreal.
Yeah, there's an example on the next slide.
Yeah, that's right. So this is like our sword, like katana slash sound cue, and this takes like a few different source sound files and selects randomly from a few different sets of them, modulates each one and combines it together. And you can see it's like a little bit different every time.
So it's not just that there's a few different slash hits. You can see, can I play that again?
I think so. Oh.
Yes. You can see, it's comprised of all the different elements of that sound as well. There's different, scraping, like scrape sounds, and then that's modulated. And all the flesh sounds, picks around and modulates, and at the end it all gets combined. So every time you hear it, it sounds like quite a unique sound. I think that's very important for sounds that are going to occur very frequently, because they quickly become annoying if you're hearing the same sound over and over.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm not going to get into too much detail here because there's like a million talks on the internet about juicing your game up, but these are some things that worked for us specifically. So probably one of the major ones we do is Hitstop time dilation on like kills. It also works for damage, but we're not doing that yet. We want to freeze animations when like a hit connects, so it's really satisfying. A lot of games do that super well, particularly fighting games.
Fighting games are a great reference for this kind of thing because they often have the fast pace energy, but they maintain the satisfaction from the hits without slowing the game down. So it's so many times we've like scrubbed through like Street Fighter, for example, like frame by frame, and just seeing like exactly what they're doing. Like you see that they don't just like freeze the entire game. Like the animations pause, but the characters are still slightly like vibrating, and the particles are still playing, and there's just like a combination of hit stop and real time effects like coming into play, which makes it not feel jarring. It feels like the game's still fluid, but you still get the satisfaction of a meaty hit stop.
In a 4-player game like ours, it's okay to pause the game when a player dies because it doesn't really happen all the time. But if every time a player took damage, the game stopped for a few frames, that will get annoying really quickly.
And again, Unreal has tools to do this, like custom time dilations per actor. You don't have to use the global time dilation. You could even do things like spawn a sphere and say, Hitstop all the actors in that sphere, just like localize it, which is something which is can be used for like shared screen Hitstops and stuff.
Yeah. Another one is audios. Don't ignore your audio, because it's really important to make things satisfying, especially on this side of things. What can I say for that? It's just like, find punchy sounds and make them work really well for what you want them to show, basically. We have characters flash when they take damage, just really quickly. It shows that something's happened to them. It's not only a tip for like action games with damage, but you could use it in like any game to just like show some kind of interaction, really.
Again, this is like it's something that sounds minor, but we're calling it out because it was a very high value task for us. It was like it's quite quick to set up something like this, but the amount that it actually added for our game was it was crazy. So I'd highly recommend doing
real camera shake. Obvious, any juice presentation will tell you camera shake #1, really good. If you make it real time and you have Hitstop, the camera will move around while the game is or the object is paused, and it will look pretty nice.
Yeah, because we had issues previously. For example, when you get a kill in our game, the camera will zoom in slow-mo, but since we were using like a global time dilation that was affecting everything, the camera shaked, like you'd see every vibration, so it looks like someone's grabbed the camera and just like, look at it, and yeah, it looked, it ruined a lot of gameplay moments, but
yeah, looking back, it's like, oh god, we had that in the game.
Yeah. So if you are going to do juice up your hits by adding Hitstop and stuff, I guess the main point for some of these is to just be very mindful about what's being affected by that, like Hitstop and time dilation, and it's good to mix and match, basically.
Yep. Another thing you can do is, this is pretty specific, but we added like a post effect that turns on when there's like a hit, like a massive smash or an explosion. It's just a few frames. I'll show you it in a sec. And it's kind of like, it's a kind of glitchy chromatic aberration effect. It's really subtle, but it really adds to the impact of that, whatever's causing it. And it's quite weird, but in motion it looks pretty cool. But yeah, another obvious thing is the particles that play. If you don't have any particles, it's pretty unsatisfying. Like this is a pretty big to-do for us on our punches. Our punches don't have any impact particles, so it's a bit like, oh, I hit Rahman and nothing really happened. His character flashed, but you don't see where the punch connected. So this is something we're actually going to be doing pretty soon, ideally. But yeah, I'll just show you a clip which shows all these coming together. I wonder if it will play. What the hell?
It's playing. Is it? I guess.
I think you meant to leave it there, and if you press a button, it'll go to the freeze frame after it.
Nice.
Can you click it?
I don't know.
Sorry, guys.
It's embarrassing.
And girls.
What the? Oh, drive link. That's nice. Oh, jeez. Do we just skip that one, or?
Yeah, just skip it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. It's a bit gross, but.
Here we go. There's a Hitstop. And a bit of slow-mo there at the end. It's hard to call out every single thing that happened in this video, but they were all on the previous frame.
So, no, not in full screen, I guess.
real professionals here.
Yeah, so here's, yeah, like I said, it's quite subtle in the actual footage, but that's actually like to what extent we are applying aberration and like post effects in game. So yeah, basically we found like adding lots of little things like that really helped to juice up our combat and make it feel really meaty when hits do occur.
Yeah, so this is the chromatic aberration post effect that we just talked about earlier. Basically just separates all channels and applies a little noise distortion to it. And it really goes a long way.
Okay. So yeah, now talking about like mechanics a bit more and some design choices we made. Yeah, again, like I'm just trying to, yeah, just highlight the high value tasks that you can just, implement real quickly and will help bring the game up to scratch. So yeah, always providing immediate feedback when inputs are pressed. Like there's a very small window for like animation and stuff, but like I was discussing earlier with the audio, as long as there's something like a particle or audio to just represent that you've done something or at least tried to do something. Like if you're in Hitstop and you try to like, attack, for example, having some kind of sound or particle to show like, your input was actually received, but it's failed. It's very important for conveyance. And like the third point there, we really want to minimize states, like self-inflicted states in particular, where players are locked out of other actions. So it's okay to, if someone's in hits done from an opponent, that's acceptable. But for example, we, for a while, like, we had a lot of states where it's like, you can't throw while attacking, or you can't cancel this, and the player was sort of locking themselves out from a lot of states, and what that led to was a lot of moments where the player's like, oh, I want to do this, and it was just, they were just totally denied, and there was no feedback there to say what happened. So that basically led to dissatisfaction. And yeah, so what we're trying to do now, and yeah, this is still a work in progress, but we found that the more states that we allow to be cancelled into each other, it really minimizes those states where a player is locked out of actions and gets a dissatisfying moment and a surprising moment where they attempt an action and it just doesn't happen and they're not sure why. The other thing, just have, we found just bumping up our character acceleration and rotation rates just helped it feel a lot more responsive, which we thought the game was fine for ages, and then one day we just bumped it up and we were like, oh, this feels like 100 times better. So definitely worth experimenting with that sort of stuff. Especially if you've set some default a long time ago and you've gotten used to it.
Like going back to how it was, we had a slower like character acceleration and rotation rate, and even just going back to that and just walking around, it's apparent like how much worse that was and how much better it is now. Obviously not applicable to every game out there. You might be constrained by this kind of stuff, but definitely mess around with it because you might improve your game and how it feels.
That's another thing we found when designing new mechanics and abilities and stuff. It was we often prefer to design a mechanic around a trade-off rather than like a cooldown or some other artificial hindrance, I guess. So what I mean by that is in a given scenario, the players should ideally have multiple equally viable, not equally, but like multiple viable options that each have their own trade-offs. And that means basically doing that makes for better balance because you don't end up with as many like sort of tier lists and, why would I ever, dash when this is like strictly better or whatever,
The big thing here is when you try to use an ability and it's on cooldown, sometimes it just doesn't feel so good, Like if you can avoid that and design it around mechanics instead.
Yeah. So like one example of that, this is our new parry mechanic. Previously it was just like, when you parry, you'd just be it's just on a massive cooldown, so you didn't get many opportunities to do it. But then that, as mentioned earlier, it felt bad because the player's like, I'm pressing parry, nothing's happening, because they're on some just massive cooldown. So instead, we've designed it so when you parry, you can do it fairly frequently, but when you do it, you're in a more vulnerable state. So it's now trade-off. It's not like a safe option that you can always spam out and it's just better to do so. Now it's like, okay, it's a trade-off. I'm going to have a chance to deflect a projectile back at my opponent or something, but if I screw it up, now I'm going to be vulnerable. And we have mechanics like designed like that all over the place, and we find it really helps, to make like a more in-depth and like fair feeling gameplay, I guess.
Yeah, another thing is if you're doing a fast-paced game, consider doing input buffering, because a lot of fighting games do it, and it makes it feel a lot nicer if you try to execute a command like an attack or something like that, and the previous attack hasn't finished yet. What it'll do is in a certain window, it will just like chain into the new attack when it's ready. Even if you weren't quite ready when you press the button, it'll happen 0.1 of a second later, and it makes it feel a lot more responsive and fluid.
Again, this comes back to minimizing those states. Like having an input buffer like that means that players can basically pull off like tighter maneuvers, and they can feel like they're doing something really awesome and complex, even if it's not quite as hard. You can mask that a little bit, as well as reduce states where they just miss the window and they just like, what the hell, because it's such a small window that they can't tell what actually happened. All they know is they pressed it and it didn't work. So that can really help with that as well. So on a similar note to that, we found that when players are in combat, particularly with melee, we found it feels very bad to have additive combat, if that makes sense. So two players are sitting there punching each other, and there's no clear winner apart from they're both taking damage. It feels like a bit of a slap fest, they're and this is better to have a binary outcome where it's like, with every interaction, there's a clear winner and loser. This is something we've also taken from fighting games.
This is pretty opinionated. Yeah, I don't know if it would work for like a MOBA, for example. But yeah, fighting games, it really works well. Yeah, for fighting games and this sort of style of game, we've found it's better for both players and spectators to see a clear winner from those interactions. Because, otherwise it's just sort of unclear as what the result of the interaction was. Currently, this is something we actually really need to change in Hyperjam. We haven't actually swapped over to the new system that we've been prototyping. Currently, if two players go in for a punch at each other and they attack at the same time, both the fists swing and they both receive damage and they both move back slightly, and it's just like, oh, I guess nobody really won that interaction. The new system we've been prototyping will actually, whoever did it first will just kind of hit the other one and cancel their attack and maybe stun them for a bit. And in the same sense of having a binary outcome, that's not to say deny the losing player of all agency. In the new systems we've been prototyping, it puts them into a different state, but they still have defensive options even while they're being beat up. They can parry the individual hits and escape that combat. So I think it's very important to bounce. Something we originally had was just a lot of offensive maneuvers in the game, lots of weapons, lots of ways to, sort of oppress an opponent. But the only defensive option was just evasion. And we found over time that, it's very important to have a good balance of both offensive and defensive options. Like I said, we've added a new parry mechanic, for example. And just that they're giving it player a choice, and there's something they can do in all situations, really just helps, situations where it's like, well, there's nothing I could have done, I lost and it was not my fault, it was the game's fault. By providing options in both scenarios, it just really helps alleviate those kind of feelings of disappointment. Yeah, I think we already talked a bit about Strictly Better in the... Yep. Was it me? One of the big things that can make your game feel really bad to players is if their loss is not in their control. If the game just decides, nope, you lose this, too bad. It really helps if you can minimize this and always make a player's loss their fault. You know, don't kill them if they can't respond to it. In the same way, we have a new. It's not new anymore. What we did, we used to have the kind of the game mode of Hyperjam. It was like if you kill someone 5 times, you win the game, right? But the problem was at the end of that 5 kills, it could often feel very sudden.
Yeah, basically you'd feel cheated. Being you can have up to 4 players in our game, and because the win condition was, and this is something we actually see in a lot of other shared screen, like local multiplayer games and stuff. Often the win condition is something like, yeah, get 10 kills or whatever. But for the other players, imagine there's 4 people in a game, one person's on, needs 1 more kill to win the game, and they kill someone. The other people who weren't in that interaction lost the game, even though they may have personally failed that round. And that's something that, we found people just being really disappointed. Like, I didn't personally screw up, but I've lost. And it felt like the game had cheated them out of the victory. So we've swapped over to needing to survive the final round to actually close out the game, which basically translates to each of the other players in the round needs to die, which, assuming the rest of the game is designed to sound, it means it's basically their fault.
It's a lot harder to win because of this. So this is like a huge design, like a balance thing. But now to actually win, you need to kind of take on everyone else at the same time, and you feel like godlike when you do it. But the other players don't feel cheated when they lost because they had a pretty good chance of stopping you, but they screwed it up.
Yeah, and it really helps the game crescendo into a moment where someone has defeated everyone else rather than just defeating one other person. So yeah. What else? Yeah, rubber banding. It's basically just, this is an obvious one. Just make sure that players don't get into a state where they think there's no hope for a comeback. Because they're going to get bored. But on the other hand, you can take it too far and it feels like someone who's good at the game, what's the point of being good? Because new players are just going to get an advantage anyway. So I think you need to balance snowballing and rubber banding mechanics together.
This is mainly for competitive.
Again, sorry, this is specific to this kind of game, but what else? Yeah, again, specific to multiplayer game, but after players are eliminated, in our game, you are able to control an airstrike and try to take out the players who are still in the round. And when we added that actually, we found that helped a lot because previously players would just be die and just look at their phone or be bored or whatever. But it keeps the players involved and engaged. And it's we've seen a few other games.
Yeah, a few other games do this. Probably the earliest I know of is Mashed, the car game. I think it was PS2 or something, early 2000s. So it has a little reticle that appears on the screen, and the dead player can lock onto another player and shoot a rocket at them and just homes in. It really keeps the players involved even after they've supposed to be eliminated from that round.
Yeah. Last thing, if deaths are funny, people are just going to be a lot less salty in general. People really love seeing rag dolls and just comical gibs or anything. But, we found that just this is very dependent on your kind of game. But if it's supposed to be a lighthearted experience, primarily geared towards fun, rather than something very serious. Funny deaths. This applies to single player games and stuff as well. I think, for example, Crossy Road or something. You can just play over and over because when you die, it's not oh fuck. It's
funny.
It's funny, and you can laugh it off and try again, and that keeps the the mood light.
Yeah, obviously if that's a very serious story-based game, it's not really going to work.
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, when you're developing, really make sure to playtest as much as you can, because every time you playtest, you'll find something different that either you need to change, or that's something that irritates you over time, and you decide you also need to change that. It really helps if you're just like constantly on the lookout for things and engaging your game in a way that other players would as well. It also really helps if you can make your game fun, because like pretty easy, just make your game fun. You can, if it's fun, you will want to playtest it. Like, we love playtesting our game, even like after we've, sat down and figured out if what we did worked or not. We're just like, hey, you want to play another round? Yep.
It's definitely a good sign and a way to weed out. If you go to playtest your game and you're grinding it out and you're playing, if you're not enjoying the playtests, like sit back and like take a step back and say, why am I not enjoying this and what can I improve? Like try to identify what it is that you're not enjoying, because I think it's, if you can after just developing, still enjoy the playtest of your own game, it's a really good sign, I think.
Yeah. Not again, but don't be afraid to throw out what doesn't work. Sometimes less is more, and if you add something and it doesn't actually make the game better, it's just taking up space. You have to really work out if it actually adds to the game and if you want to keep it in there.
It's like, don't be afraid to prototype, and try new things, but it can be hard not to get attached to things. It's very important to quickly iterate, not get attached, and just be okay to like throw things out if they don't work, because your game will suffer if you don't.
Yeah, another thing is definitely do as much iteration as possible on like level blockouts, for example, like grey boxing, white boxing, whatever you want to call it, before doing your environment art. We had this, like early on, we jumped straight into doing environment art for our levels, and what that meant was we never really got a chance to kind of make it the levels actually fun and work well mechanically. And it's a lot harder to move things around when all the art's already made. You can do it, but it's just easier to do as much testing as possible when you're in there.
It's basically, you just can't think that you're like, you're better than like the concept art and white boxing stages. It's like, I feel like when we were less experienced with this stuff, like we were like, that's just overhead, who needs it? But now, look, coming back to it after a few years of development, we're like, we can really see the value a lot more clearly. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's, just that quick iteration on something, before it's more fleshed out is really, it's definitely worth it.
A lot of our iteration cycle these days is kind of based around the lowest point of the game, like what's the worst part, whether graphically or mechanically. We just say, what's really annoying us? Like we need to change this, improve it. If we like repeat this over and over again, it kind of raises the quality bar for your game, and you end up with just a much better end product.
Yeah, it's basically how we prioritize what we're going to work on next. It's just like, what is our least favorite part about the game? What do we, if you could change one thing about the game, and what would it be? And it's tempting to constantly add new features and new modes and all this stuff, and you do need to eventually. But what we found, especially coming from a student project, was like we added all this content, but now we've had to go back and bring that up to the new standard. So and in that sense, it makes sense to just work from the worst point and bring it all up together to avoid redoing more work.
Yeah, we could have added new weapons and perks and all those kinds of things, but the game still might look like the 2015 version. So we kind of like decided we want to make a very polished vertical slice, if you will, of what is the best the game can be and expand from there. Because, Do you want to do that? Another thing is when you're getting feedback, especially as a student or a new developer, you might be tempted to just kind of like take it personally and just like brush it off and be like, nah, that doesn't, no point really thinking about that. When we released to Greenlight, well, not like we put a trailer on Greenlight in about a year ago now. Yeah, it was a year ago. It was during PAX last year. A bunch of people on the internet were just like, hey, is this blur, it's pretty shit, by the way, it hurts my eyes. And we were just like, we didn't really know because we had gotten used to it. It wasn't really a blur, it's kind of like a chromatic aberration on the edge of the screen. We use it to make the game feel a bit more retro, and at the time when we added it, it was really cool, but I guess it's really hard to see. Can you see it there? Yeah, the vending machine. It's a bit like blurry around the edges because of the chromatic aberration, So, what do we do? We just brushed it off. No one else has complained about it.
Yeah.
Why is it an issue to these people now?
It's so hard, especially taking a game like ours to an event like PAX. All you get is like, and you're showing to friends and family, all you get is, this is great, this is awesome. And then when people say these sort of things, it can be easy to be like, nah, they don't know what they're talking about. But then reflecting back on it, and you just see, yeah, they were totally right. And we do see this a lot as well when, just looking at other like student games and stuff. We'll try to, just give an honest piece of feedback, but instead of taking it on board, in the same way we did, people, their first reaction is to get defensive and try to justify their choice or discount it. And it's just really important to be humble and just, I mean, not all feedback is good. Like, I mean, people do say things that are, basically just straight up wrong. But never, if you are going to ignore a piece of feedback, that should be a very conscious decision. And you say, okay, that's wrong because of this. And just be very aware that people usually know what they're talking about.
Version control is very important to building a stable product. We use Git. Other options include perforce and subversion and whatnot. We find that Git works okay with like large assets when you're using LFS. This is large file storage because it just sends the your binary files, your assets to the server, which can be separated from the actual source code side of things. And it's really, I find Git more efficient because of the branching and merging side of things over something like SVN or perforce. It really helps programming productivity specifically. We use feature branches. Basically, whenever we're making a new feature or bug fix, we just split off from the master branch, which is always stable. We make sure the new thing is tested fully before merging it back in, which we do with pull requests, so we can kind of review each other's code and assets and things like that. And it really helps to keep a version of the game that always just works, and you don't have to worry about kind of breaking everyone else's stuff when you're working on it.
It basically means you can go pretty crazy in your own feature branch and multitask if you need to stop that and swap to a new feature or bug fix or something. It's all sitting there. If you're not using Git, just use it. What else? Just like a few time savers. These are, first two are very specific to Unreal.
Yeah.
You can use Swarm to, when you're building lighting, it can take forever. Swarm is very easy to set up and allow you to use all the computers on your network to share that workload, and that has sped up level iteration a lot for us.
Same thing works with shaders compiling. If you use a shared derived data cache, you can kind of compile the shaders once and then use the same ones on all the computers on your network, which just really speeds things up.
That was, really annoying in the past. Like, we would just always have to, every time someone pulled a new branch, it would be like, oh, time to compile 1,000 shaders or something. That's sped up a lot.
Invest in your tools. It really helps to have like a dev menu or a debug menu where you can quickly use to test things.
So this is an example of our dev menu. Before we had this, it could be pretty hard to. Oh, don't tell me this is not going to autoplay either. Oh no.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to play it.
Don't we?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, basically invest time in your dev tools. It's definitely worth it. I guess I'll just like hammer through the rest of these quickly. Yeah, finding bugs, use shadow play, record everything. There's plenty of bugs that they're not crashes, they're just like weird, you occasionally fall through the floor, and the only way we've been able to fix them is by recording the screen and then just like cross-referencing and being like, oh, okay, this only happens with like this weapon and then the last ammo with these two stacks of this particular power-up or something, and
it's just
really,
impossible
really
to find
useful.
otherwise. Like,
yeah, do regular builds because fixing build errors takes forever. So if you do them regular, you won't get caught out and basically be screwed. For Unreal, make sure you have the editor symbol so you can break into engine code, and you can attach Visual Studio to the standalone process as well, which is very helpful, and we didn't know that for a while. Lastly, if you have bots, they are very useful for finding bugs. Like, they can just grind through the games just over and over, and yeah, they'll constantly uncover weird stuff as long as they're coded to go through the same routes as the player does. Yeah.
so blueprints in Unreal are very powerful. Obviously you can iterate so fast if you're just tweaking little bits of logic, and it really makes a difference if you're not recompiling the whole game every time you do that. That being said, they're good for really high-level logic, like if you have weapons and power-ups and things like that. We here at BitDragon, we use blueprints for higher-level stuff and C++ for foundations and all our core frameworks and stuff like that. And those two kind of integrate really nicely. So your bottom layer is really like stable and robust, and your upper layer is very quick to iterate on, and it works pretty well. You can always have C++ base classes for blueprints if you need the best of both worlds.
Yeah. How are we going for time? Okay. Yeah. Can avoid circular dependencies by using interfaces. They're a lot better in like later versions of Unreal, but prior to 4.17, circular dependency issues were horrifying. And in general, it's just bad practice. So yeah, make good use of interfaces and components. They're a great way to keep things modular and reusable. For example, we have like a health component in our game that we can attach to other actors, and they just get like a health bar and fire death events and all that. Yeah, and if there's components don't do certain things, like you need to use like a timeline, for example, you can use a child actor and use it in a similar way. Do we have time for this? Probably not.
And a gameplay abilities plugin is something we've been looking at recently. It's for Unreal, and it's insanely powerful if you need to build complex game mechanics like MOBA, RPG elements, anything like that. I'm not going to read out all of this, but it's incredibly powerful and networked and optimized. And I wish we had it 2 years ago when we started building this, because it would just make life a lot easier if we didn't have to do it all from scratch. Okay. Especially if you're making an online game.
Let's wrap it up.
Yep.
All right, we'll just wrap it up here because everyone needs to go to other talks. But yeah, thanks for coming and hearing us talk, and let me know if you have any questions.